And now I start seeing it less as an underdog story and more of a Goliath, what were you thinking story? What you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, yeah.
Goliath was the underdog here.
We're in the middle of our stories from Sunday school, and our approach to this has been stories from the Bible that sometimes we relegate to kids' stories. Maybe that's not always fair, but that's just kind of how we're framing this series. And we're trying to pull out a lot more meaning in it than you typically hear at church. And you may or may not agree with us, but that's what we're trying to do in this series. So we talked about Noah and the Ark last episode. This time we're going to talk about David and Goliath, which is another one where people, I think, immediately go, oh, yeah, I know that story. And we're going to try and pull more out of it than that.
Well, and I was going to say that we don't call this series Sunday School Stories because these are stories for children. We call them that because there's stories that most of us were first introduced to as children. But the ironic thing, and I thought about this last episode, is that they're actually some of the most really sophisticated, literary, some of the most theological stories in the entire Bible. And that's really the mark of a transcendent story, is children can enjoy them, but adults are supposed to eventually understand them. But a lot of our Sunday school stories, they're so transcendent that we introduce them as children, but we just never get around to the adult reading of them because we think that they're for children. And as we discovered last week, they're not at all.
Yeah, exactly. So the story of David and Goliath, because people are familiar with this story, we're not going to go through every detail of the story. Right. And so if you're jumping into this, like on our fairy tale stories, sometimes we actually let people listen to the whole fairy tale.
Right.
And so we're assuming that most people are familiar with these stories. The way we're going to walk through this, you're not going to hear the entire story, but you understand the cliff notes, right? David was a shepherd boy. He faces Goliath, the giant, who is mocking the armies of Israel. And David says, I'm going to take him on. He gets 5 smooth stones. I'm doing the real Cliff Notes version here. And
I was about to say, you're giving away the end.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, right?
Yeah.
And he takes one with his slingshot, and he sinks the stone into the giant's forehead, and the giant falls dead. And David's victorious, right? So everyone knows that version of the story.
Yeah, it's the classic underdog story. David and Goliath, we use it in modern terminology all the time. It's just become a shorthand way of saying that someone pulled off an impossible win.
Yeah, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, I think, about David and Goliath along these lines, which is actually a pretty good book.
Yeah.
In college football, a lot of times when some D2 school pulls the big upset, they talk about a David and Goliath moment, right?
Yeah, App State, to this day. App State over Michigan.
Michigan.
I mean,
gosh. No, that's the first thing that came to my mind, too. That's so funny. Yeah, but that's what David and Goliath has become associated with. And it's not false, but at the same time, as we'll get into, I don't think it fully captures what that story was supposed to convey.
I think something that's worth mentioning right out of the gate is that one thing that's overlooked is that it's not merely a story about courage, which is the way most people read it. This story ties into the broader narrative about kingship. It's like that's the bigger story that 1 Samuel is tackling, is who is the rightful king of Israel, right? When we start off with the story of David and Goliath, this story has this image of Saul being head and shoulders taller than anyone else. You remember when he's chosen king.
Yeah.
But he's basically hiding in this tent while David, who isn't even supposed to be on the battlefield, is acting like the king. And that contrast is brilliant because it sets up the tension between these two for the entire book. And so anyway, that's an important thing to keep in mind as we kind of zoom into this particular story, is the broader story of kind of kingship. I don't know if there's another kind of broad narrative that you think is worth pointing out at the beginning to be looking for or not, but that's what popped in my head.
Yeah, it's definitely kingship. The other one, broad stroke, I will paint, and then we can jump into it because I don't want to start giving away everything. But it's really the completion of Joshua conquering the Promised Land.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've realized recently as well that I never put together. But it really is written in a way that when David kills Goliath, it's like, okay, Joshua's conquest is now complete. And
yes,
so
that's right.
That's another important overarching theme that really frames this story. And so I'm not sure the ancient reader would go, oh, there's no way, Dave pulls the big upset. I'm not sure they would see that. I think they would say, okay, Joshua has finally conquered the promised land.
Especially with a lot of the symbolism that we're going to pull out of this and point out in this episode. It's going to be really obvious that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
And to your point, I don't think the ancient reader would have missed that.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing I was thinking before we jump in was last episode about Noah and the ark. There were kids' songs about Noah and the ark. You were even humming one of them at one point. And I was thinking, I don't know, is there a kid's song about David and Goliath? Did Bullfrogs and Butterflies ever feature David and Goliath?
I don't think so. You're right. How did they miss the boat on this? Man.
Yeah.
Well, what we need to do is hop into one of those AI music makers and get us a David and Goliath song that every kid in America is going to be singing in Sunday school.
Oh, yeah. We'll make millions.
Yeah. I mean, we have to skip the part about where he chops his head off and things like that. But, yeah, surely there's a good David and Goliath kid song.
I feel like there is one that I'm just missing, but I can't think of it on the top of my head. But, yeah, there's 2 or 3 songs about Noah that I could hum to you right now. I could sing.
Okay, I had to look this up, and there is one called Only a Boy Named David. And it's weird because I'm sitting here reading the lyrics, and it's all coming back to me. And round and round and round and round and round and round and round. And one little prayer went up to God, and the giant came tumbling down. There you go. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I forgot all about that. Okay, so we missed the mark on that, but you're right. It's not as memorable. At least it didn't pop in my head when we were preparing for this.
No, never thought of it. But as soon as you started humming it, I thought, yeah, that sounds familiar now. It's all coming back to me. All right.
Oh, yeah. Yep. There you go. Okay. All right, so where are we going to start with this?
All right. Last episode, I think I said, ask people to read 1 Samuel 17 if you wanted to. And we're going to hit parts of this, but again, we're not going to go through the entire story. But let's have people listen to 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 through 9, and then we'll kick it off, starting to talk about framing this story.
A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield-bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us."
Okay, so there you heard the description of this giant Goliath, right? Talks about his armor, talks about he was a Philistine from Gath, and he's mocking the troops, right? Saying, who wants to fight me, basically? And no one does, because he's a giant.
Right.
But there's a lot going on, I feel like, and probably I'll just warn the listeners right now. I feel like there's a lot of setup here to understand what we miss just reading the story, because we read the story about the description of Goliath, and we think it's saying, oh, this is a really huge guy.
Right.
And in some ways it is, but it's saying a lot more than that, okay? So let's back up and let's talk about the Philistines, all right? So the Philistines, you could think of them as the primary nemesis of Israel.
Yep.
And actually, I'm coming to learn, we talk so much about Judges. We've been working on this project with Judges, so I'm studying Judges a lot. And I never put it together before that 1st and 2nd Samuel is basically a continuation of the story of Judges.
Right.
And so Judges ends with Samson bringing down the temple of Dagon on all the Philistines.
Philistines, that's right.
Yeah, right?
Yep.
And so Judges, in a way, represents that, okay, Samson has now delivered Israel from the Philistines. But actually, he doesn't. He just dealt them a really crippling blow. Because once Saul becomes king, and then David to follow, right? But we're not there yet. The Philistines are still a thorn in the Israel side.
Sure. Yeah, they took the Ark of the Covenant, right, in previous chapters. I think I got my timeline right.
Yeah, with Saul.
That's right. And so anyway, there's a lot of history there, that maybe you can try to compact into a paragraph or two. I don't know, but there is a lot going on.
Probably not a paragraph, but okay, so the Philistines were made up of 5 cities, and each city had a king. and they're Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. And it's weird. I don't know if we experienced this when you and I went to Israel. On a previous trip, I actually saw, I mean, you still see signs today for Ashkelon, which is almost really jarring, right? It's, you're driving down the Israel highway and it's like Ashkelon that way. And you're like, oh, crap, the Philistines.
Well, I mean, Gaza is all in the news. I mean,
Gaza, right.
Here it is, the ancient city.
Yeah.
In fact, it's probably we'll put up a map because basically the Philistine territory is modern-day Gaza. It's a little bit bigger than that.
Sure.
That's pretty interesting considering the news headlines of today.
Yeah, there's something about Israel's inability to conquer that land, and still an issue today, right? It's still
it's kind of wild.
A thorn in their side today.
Yeah, did you see the prison exchange? It's basically when Hamas was giving back all the captured Israelis from the October 7th attack. They were arranging this exchange, and there's this big banner that Hamas had behind them when they gave back the POWs from Israel back to Israel, right? And it is a six-fingered fist. So it's a fist that's being held up, and it has 6 fingers on it, which we'll get into a little bit. But that's a sign of a giant. You know, the giant, the Nephilim, had 6 fingers, and the quote on it says, "We are the flood." Again, as we're talking about this, I know it was really people comment, and it's like, man, their AI put 6 fingers on the fist, and it's like, no, that is absolutely intentional.
Yeah.
It's like saying we're the giants, and so. Exactly what you were saying is this sounds like an ancient story, but it's been brought into the modern day, and even the back and forth there is today with it. And that territory identifies themselves as Palestinians, but that's just a paraphrase of Philistines. And they embrace that idea, the 6-fingered fist, we are the flood. It's just, I don't know. I saw that. I thought it was wild. We'll put a picture of it up to make sure,
Okay. Well, as soon as you said the 6-finger fist, I was like, oh, wow. I have not caught that, but yeah, that's absolutely correct and intentional.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So anyway, we're painting this picture of the Philistines because they are the nemesis. And so the other thing about the Philistines is they are identified with the sea peoples who actually come over from Greece when the Bronze Age collapses. And we're going to get into that here in a little bit as well, because that's going to play into this story. So actually, when Israel is fighting to take over the Promised Land, and they're taking on the Amalekites and the Midianites and all the other ites, and they kind of dispatch with them. But the Philistines, the reason why you hear the Philistines come in late and then are this big problem for the Israelites is because of this migration with the Sea Peoples and the collapse of the Bronze Age. So this isn't just a little tribe they had to dispatch of. This was an entire migration. So Philistia is growing and growing and growing, even as Israel is trying to establish their boundaries in the Promised Land.
Yeah, and to go back to that map of the Philistine territory, is that territory was kind of the gateway to coastal trade in the Mediterranean. And so as long as the Philistines controlled it, they cut Israel off from valuable markets. It's hard to see on a map, but because you look at Israel and you're like, well, they got plenty of coastline. But that was a very key deep water port at the time, and that was kind of the gateway into the Mediterranean trade.
Yeah, in some ways, the Philistines stood for everything that was almost anti-Israel, right? Because you have Philistines that are led by 5 kings, which are really just, they were kings of all the 5 cities of Philistia. I think it's called the Pentapolis, which just means 5 cities. So you're right, they controlled a lot of the trade. So they were basically cutting off Israel's ability to trade, and they were already very advanced in trading. They were also technologically advanced, and that's something you're going to hear through the story as well. And again, to our modern ears, we sometimes don't pick up when it's describing something, we don't hear that as technologically advanced, not like they were using AI or they had iPhones or, we would pick up on that. But little things back in the time the Bible was written, readers would go, oh, wow, yeah, they have a huge advantage because they have a huge technological advantage.
Right.
Once you get a picture of who the Philistines are, you know that this is not just another battle that Israel's having. They're battling the very thing that is keeping them from fully possessing the Promised Land, and they're battling basically the antithesis of everything that Israel represents. And I read scholarly articles that say, oh, the Philistines weren't that bad. And okay, I get all that. But to the Israelites, they represented everything that Israel wasn't.
Right. But not just in the religious arena of multiple gods versus a singular God, that type of things.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just like you said, the moving forward of the nation, because they're cut off to trade, because they have to, we'll get into this, they have to go to the Philistines for just basic everyday things like sharpening their farm implements. And yeah, they just stood in the way of their progress. And so you're right. It is a much deeper conflict than just the idea that the enemies are at the gates and there's all these border squabbles, things like that. It goes a lot deeper than that.
Yeah.
And so the Philistines really represent the progress and the moving forward of the Israelites on a broader scale.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this battle is emblematic of a much bigger conflict, right? This isn't just one other battle that Israel has with their neighbors, all right?
Right. And so when we get into the description of Goliath, keep that in mind, because Goliath, on even a smaller scale, embodies that conflict.
Yeah, so let's start talking about Goliath, because in that passage we just listened to, it describes this giant, right? It describes his armor, his sword, all that in kind of bigger than life terms, and there's a reason for that. So I don't know, what are some of the things that first jumped out at you about Goliath?
Yeah, as we get into Goliath, the first thing that hit me is that when you start kind of Googling and digging around about his height, because I always heard he was 10 foot, 12 foot, something like that, there's kind of a discrepancy between the Hebrew text, the original Hebrew text that makes him about 9 foot, 9 inches, because it was like 6 cubits in a span. And then the Septuagint lists him as 4 cubits in a span, which comes out to like 6'9". And I don't know, do you want to explain that? What's the discrepancy between those two sources? Because that's a pretty dramatic difference. Even in biblical times when 6-footers they wouldn't be considered giants, but they were certainly considered tall.
Sure.
Most people weren't that height. I think I read that people were probably average, maybe the average male was 5'2", 5'3". And so a 6-footer would be a significant height advantage. But that's a pretty big discrepancy. I wouldn't call a 6-footer, even back then, a quote-unquote giant.
Yeah. There's definitely that discrepancy there. I'm not going to pretend that I know all the ins and outs, but what I do understand is that Hebrew numbers are notoriously difficult sometimes to translate. First of all, because they're not numbers, they're letters.
Right, yeah.
And so it's difficult sometimes to read. Like, I know there are passages in the Old Testament where you don't know whether they're talking about thousands or hundreds, just based on the way it's written. And that's where we get some of these numbers where there are battles featuring like 500,000 people, or is it trying to say that there were only 5,000 people? And frankly, we're not sure, right? Yeah. So in some of those cases, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint actually gives us more insight into how people back then understood the stories, either through tradition or through their own translating. The bottom line is we don't know whether he was 9'9" or whether he was 6'6", but the Septuagint at least says that he was basically what you said in cubits, but about 6'6", which, like you said, which would make him a giant back in that day in some sense, but it also wouldn't mean he was 10 foot tall. Almost something that's a little like unbelievable.
Well, one theory that is probably worth mentioning is that some manuscripts have Goliath's heights as closer to Saul's, right? Remember, Saul was a head taller than any man in Israel, is how they describe him. And so if Goliath was described as 6'6" or whatever, this makes Saul and Goliath more like equals, which, to your point, when you said the Greek translation, it was more about the mythic understanding of the story. When you make Saul and Goliath equal, it highlights Saul's cowardice, to what I said at the beginning. Saul's hiding in his tent. And so I think that's kind of an interesting, I'm not saying that I'm certain that that's what that means, but yeah, if you kind of make them a little bit more equal, now you've got, Wyatt and Saul going out there. Saul is head and shoulders above his men. Why wouldn't he's the obvious choice to go meet Goliath on the field of battle?
Yeah. That makes sense. But there's something deeper here, even. I don't think this story is actually trying to establish his height and weight for the roster, right? Like we would read.
Right, not in a scientific way.
In an NBA roster, it's like this guy's 7'1", and he weighs 260 pounds. You're like, okay, that guy's a giant, right?
Yeah.
So it's not trying to communicate that so much as it's trying to communicate that he is a giant in the biblical sense, okay? And we are going to return to this topic of the Nephilim. And I know people might roll their eyes and go, oh, here we go again. But
yay, more Nephilim.
But I'm telling you, it's there. Like, I think this story is meant to convey that he's a giant. He's a descendant of the Nephilim.
Okay.
And so described as 9'9". All right. And you see how it describes his armor. It's almost like he's more trying to say this is an otherworldly, like half human being, half spiritual being, right? Rather than trying to tape measure and see exactly how tall he is.
No, that's definitely the first thing you need to realize as far as kind of the mythology behind the story, is that's important. But I'll make another argument for the 9-foot height estimate, is that in the verses we just read, it says that his armor weighed, was it 5,000 shekels? That comes out to about 150 to 175 pounds. And the spearhead, just the head of the spear, was 15 pounds. And so imagine a 6'9" athlete, LeBron James. LeBron James is 6'9". He weighs between, depending on when he started his career and when he ended his career, right? He's put on a few pounds. But he weighs between 250 and 275 pounds. And so if just this coat of armor, like I'm not counting the weight of the helmet, the shin guards, or the shield, right? If just the weight of the armor is half of Goliath's body weight, assuming he's 6'9", then he'd almost be completely immobile. But if he's 9'6", now his body weight would be closer to 500 to 600 pounds, which is just bananas. But that would be the scale. And so now the armor is around 25 to 30% of his total weight, which is what modern soldiers carry in combat. And so it kind of helps. I don't know. I think there's to get into the scientific of pulling out the tape measure. I just think that helps out. And the other thing is like the spearhead was 15 pounds, meaning the total spear would probably be closer to 20 or 25 pounds at the very least. And if you asked like a major league pitcher to throw a javelin this weight, it would immediately destroy his rotator cuff. And it would be, and even if you could throw it, you're not throwing it more than 15, 20 feet. I was in Target the other day, killing time, Amy's shopping. And so I was wandering around and I walked by the fitness section and I had this in the back of my mind. And there it is, a 15-pound weight. So I picked it up. I did kind of the football throw, motion. Yeah. And I thought, this just the weight of it. Like I almost pulled a muscle just flexing it back and forth. And obviously I'm a 6-foot tall guy, so this doesn't completely hold water. But I'm saying that even a LeBron James would tear up his arm trying to throw this.
Yeah.
But again, a 9-foot guy, that's about the weight. That's about the scale that you're talking about it. So I just think I kind of lean toward he is more like a 9-foot guy just because they gave us the measurements and the weight of his armor and his spear and things like that. And I think that holds more weight considering the size of a 9-foot guy as opposed to a 6'8", 6'9", even though that would be considered a very tall, maybe giant person in the ancient world.
Yeah. We're not going to solve the debate. The counter to that, I would say, would be, are they describing a larger-than-life person, so they're describing a larger-than-life armor? So let me give you this example. So if I could say, I'm a Dodgers fan, right? So, man, have you seen Shohei Ohtani? You're like, he's not bad. Yeah. He's not a bad baseball player. And I'd say, man, I just never seen anything like a guy who can hit a baseball 600 feet and he can throw 120 miles an hour. And 2 seasons ago, he stole 59 bases. He can run a 8-second 100 meters.
Right.
Like, Now, if you know anything about the game, all that is exaggeration, right?
Sure.
But
dramatized to make a point.
But you would also get the point that this guy is not. It's almost like he's freakishly not a real human being, almost, right? He's just this unbelievably gifted athlete. So the counter to that might be, I wonder if they're putting all this in mythic terms. But we don't know is the
Right.
bottom line.
Right.
We
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
If you're digging around the Middle East trying to dig up a giant, it might be a while. I don't know. Because we don't really, right? Even when we talked about the Nephilim last episode, it's like we're not entirely sure what they were referring to. But we do know that there's a lot more to this idea of being a giant than simply their height and weight.
Yes. Well, we talked about, and we'll talk about in this episode, we talked about the idea of 40. It doesn't necessarily, don't get hung up on 40 literal days or 40 literal years. Understand what the meaning behind that is. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, I tend to think that when they describe something specifically, like this is what his breastplate weighed and this is what his spearhead weighed, I tend to take that literally because they're making the broader point. You're right that the idea of the giant, it could mean a giant in terms of size, or it could mean a giant in terms of significance and power and all the other things that it could mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think it's interesting that they kind of maybe show their hand a little bit with specific weights for those things.
Yeah.
But again, that may be representative of something else too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. That leads to the importance of why would they so specifically identify him as a giant? And you may be listening to last episode and go, well, wait, I thought you said all the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood. So why are there
problematic, isn't it?
Why are there giants around? Okay. You want to field that one? Or
Oh gosh. I mean, you talk about a rabbit trail. You have about 3 options, and that is that either Nephilim DNA made it through the flood via the wives of Noah's sons, because Noah's generation was pure in all his generations.
That is one theory, yeah.
Right, that it came through one of them. You could make the argument that the physical bodies, we talked about this last episode, that the physical bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed, but their spirits were still allowed to roam the earth. Mm-hmm. Maybe their spirits entered into somebody, and there was some sort of way to bring back the giants that way. Maybe not the full-on Nephilim, but ways to bring back that giant DNA, introduce that back into the human bloodline. I said 3. What would be the third?
Yeah, the third would be that the same rituals that kind of united these fallen spirits with the pagan tribes were picked up after the flood as well.
Yeah, happened after the flood.
Yeah.
So those are kind of your 3 options. I don't know which one it is, but there clearly is some sort of Nephilim, at least a Nephilim reference after the flood, whether it's figurative or literal.
Well, and so
I've got another argument for the literal, but go ahead. We'll get to that in a second.
So it's interesting that I realized at the story of Noah, when you read Genesis 6:1-4, one of the things that it said, in those days there were Nephilim on the earth, but then it says, and also after the flood. So it actually says,
yeah, it does.
Yeah, remember that? It says right there that it kind of acknowledges that while the flood was meant to take care of the Nephilim problem, it was still an issue, albeit not as bad, for reasons you can go back and listen to the last episode. But there's acknowledged that it was still a problem, right? And so when Israel is coming into the promised land, one of the things that is a clue that it's still an issue is that they talk about the Rephaim, the Anakim, right? Mm-hmm. The Perizzites, the Hizzites, and I'm not
Zimzaman or yeah. There's several names for them. Yes.
Yeah, and we tend to just gloss over those and go, yeah, whatever, this list of tribes. But actually, that's actually communicating that these are giant clans,
right?
And
well, Canaan. They appeared as grasshoppers, or the spies from Canaan came back and said, we appear as grass. And so obviously that's post-flood, and so the Canaanites, sure, were. Yeah. Okay, so this is interesting. In the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes that the very bones of the giants who were defeated in Canaan are on display in the town of Hebron. In Book 5, Chapter 2, Section 3, for which reason they removed their camp to Hebron, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left a race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations to other men. And so, I mean, you read that, at the very least, Josephus, who was easily the most respected and cited historian in all of antiquity, right, clearly believed that the biblical giants were literal giants to the point that he says, go to Hebron and check out the bones. Now you can make an argument that these were mistaken animal bones,
I would make an argument,
something like that. Right, whatever.
That they were T-Rex bones.
T-Rex, maybe, right?
He found a T-Rex.
Yeah, maybe. But at the very least, it's a pretty compelling argument for what people at the time believed about giants.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So Josephus, what was he? 80 A.D., something like that?
Well,
First century.
Fall of Jerusalem, so 70 A.D., and then he, was taken to Rome.
So it's a pretty good account of what ancient people, or at least first century people, believed. They thought that they were physically large giants because they had their bones on display in Hebron.
Yeah, okay. No, that's interesting. And look, we talked about this before, but even at the time of Jesus, this would have been seen as all kinds of signaling that these are offspring of the Nephilim. These are part of the giant clan, and that's part of the reason why Israel was having such a difficult time getting rid of the Philistines. Now, I don't know that they consider all the Philistines a giant clan because they were, the sea peoples, but Gath specifically, it mentions later on, we'll get to this, it mentions that Goliath had brothers and there were other giants of Gath. So Gath is definitely identified as a giant clan.
Right. And like you said, it may not be all of them, every person, but yes, they definitely had them in the arsenal, right?
Yeah. All right, so regardless, I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of signals that David and the giant means something much different today than it does then.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's much deeper. Yeah.
All right, you want to talk about his bronze armor? Why that's significant?
Yeah, just a few chapters earlier in 1 Samuel 13, it says that no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords and spears. Right, so this is leading up to this interaction with David and Goliath. And so it goes on to say that the Israelites had to travel down to the Philistines to get their farm tools sharpened. And it says in verse 22, so on the day of the battle, talking about on the day of David and Goliath's battle.
Yeah.
So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. So that's like a pretty clear discrepancy between the two armies. So it's not just, to what you said about the bronze, it's not just about the size of Goliath. It's about a complete technological disconnect between the two, to the point that the Israelites didn't even have swords other than the king and his son.
Yeah, that's right. And that's something I'll actually save this for later, but that's something I want to talk about that's a carryover from Judges. Judges represents battles over and over and over again of the technologically advanced weaponry of the enemy versus the farm implements, right? How does Gideon? Right. Gideon takes a pitcher and a torch, right? And he defeats this army, right? So they're always stressing that the enemy had this technological advantage, but God was able to overcome it. And you're going to see that same pattern here in David and Goliath as well.
Yeah, we read it as just a description, like, oh, they had chariots of iron, okay, or they had armor of bronze. But the ancients clearly see that as a technological advancement because it was. If you didn't have the means to smelt, copper and tin together, you couldn't get bronze. Yeah. And bronze is a whole lot stronger than both of those things by themselves. And so it really would have highlighted the technological difference between the two cultures or the two civilizations. They were just periods apart.
My understanding, too, of bronze, because I think there's a lot going on here, is we talk about the collapse of the Bronze Age, which literally means that 1200 BC, I think, or 1177 is what one author kind of tags as the collapse of the Bronze Age. People were able to produce bronze. And when a bunch of factors caused the collapse of the Bronze Age, the fall of Troy being one of them, and some other things, but trade routes were cut off. And so my understanding is that the ingredients you needed, the components to make bronze, were no longer available because the trade routes were cut off because they basically collapsed, right? So
that goes back to the port.
Yeah.
Control of the port.
Yeah. Goes back to the port. So when you're reading here that he had this armor of bronze, that's like, okay, so you know how sometimes they talk about, Göbekli Tepe or You know what I'm talking about? This,
that ancient.
Yeah. In Turkey, like this ancient technology all of a sudden. And we're like, how did they do that? Like, I think that the idea of bronze hits that way to an ancient reader. It's like, bronze, what are they doing with bronze? No one has bronze.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's actually playing into this idea of, this is a giant. This is an otherworldly person. And where the heck did they get this technology? Because no one has bronze. And actually,
right.
The Bronze Age goes to the Iron Age. My understanding is that bronze is stronger than iron. So,
wow. No, I didn't realize that.
So it's like an ancient technology that these people had. And again, this is not just a description of his armor. This is like he's armed with laser beams and,
Yeah. Well, we'll get into this when it comes to the slingshot. But yeah, on the surface, the Philistines completely outmatched the farm implements of the Israelites.
Right.
And I just think it's funny that the narrator spends more verses describing Goliath's equipment than he does giving David's appearance, for instance. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like everything about Goliath screams technology, military power, wealth, civilization, empire, right? And then David shows up bringing his brother's lunch, right? So the author, the author is intentionally making Goliath ridiculous by over-describing him. Do you know what I mean? Like, or at least the contention between the two. It's just absurd by this over description of Goliath. And again, I think it has more weight than him trying to set the record straight. This is the type of armor he had. This is the type of spear he had. This is how much it weighed. It wasn't a roster entry like you were saying. It's more like he's just going out of his way to say, do you understand the gulf between these two armies as far as the technology available?
Yeah, and again, one of the descriptors of the Nephilim where they were technologically advanced. We talked about that last episode. So again, I just want to make that clear, that the reason they're describing him as so technologically advanced is linked to the fact that they're also describing him as a giant. The two go hand in hand.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right? All right.
Yeah, and we'll move on, but it's just we can't overstate that thread that goes all the way back to Genesis. Because, again, we know the story so well that we think of it in isolation.
Yeah.
And it's not that way at all. And so we're just trying to let the listener pick up on the thread that goes all the way back to the flood, that goes all the way back to all the skirmishes leading up, Canaan, everything leading up to this point. There's a lot of baggage that you kind of have to unpack to really appreciate the weight of this story.
Yeah. All right. In verse 8 and 9, the last thing I want to point out here, and then we can move on to the next section, is it's really this champion's challenge. So when Goliath is coming out and saying, you pick your best warrior and you fight me, right? This is actually the way that the ancient world settled a lot of battles. And one reason is because it wasn't just one-on-one, you versus me. It was my God versus your God.
Right.
And so the stronger God was actually going to prevail. And that's how they saw it. Mm-hmm. So if your guy can beat my guy, hey, your God's stronger. Game over. We can all go home.
Right. Yeah, every battle was assumed to reveal whose God was stronger. And David actually says that, right? Doesn't he say, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel? Like that's more than just this is my belief. That is the fundamental rallying cry of the whole conflict. So he's not trying to become famous. Like he's literally defending God's reputation when he does this. And that's a whole lot different than the whole, the believe in yourself narrative that a lot of story books like to apply to this.
Yeah. Or even in your little song about David, how, his prayers went up. And this isn't just a nice flowery prayer that my God, God's the God of the earth. He's actually saying, and we'll get into this too, he's actually saying, like, look, why are we afraid? Our God can beat their God. And therefore, our champion can beat their champion. To David, I don't think he saw this as the underdog thing. I think he felt, in any way, he's like, I'm going to take Goliath down. I've got Yahweh on my side.
Well, it has echoes of the Canaan story where the spies come back and they say, man, we look like grasshoppers to these guys. And Joshua and Caleb say, yeah, they look like grasshoppers to our God. How come you're not seeing it in that reference? And so this kind of becomes a story about how do we view the enemy in the context of our God. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like, man, there's all kinds of things that scare me when I compare it to myself. But when I compare it to my God, or if I believe that in my soul, which is what Israel claims to believe, then all these giants, all these things that come into conflict with Israel is nothing compared to their God. And David is simply proving that that's actually what I believe, as opposed to a war cry slogan that I'm going to say running into battle.
Yeah. In that way, it's almost an encapsulation of entering the promised land again. It's almost like, look, we spent 100 years trying to take the promised land and secure it, and we never did it. Now the Philistines are on this scene. It's almost like David and Goliath now, like, this is the encapsulation of the last several hundred years, and we're going to have a final showdown, right? Because same thing, I like that you said that. Like the two spies said, everyone else said they've got giants in the land. There's no way. And they said, nope, we got God on our side. We got this, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to bite my tongue because we'll get into this later. But yeah, the pattern of the water, the wilderness, and the mountain. We'll get into it later. But yeah, it really does echo. And once you see it, golly, you just see it in every story, and this story is no exception.
Yeah. Let's have people listen to 12 through 16, and then we can kind of move the story forward. But I know that was a lot of background, but I think it's so important to understanding the actual conflict. So this is 1 Samuel 17, verses 12 through 16.
Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand.
Okay, so I think we've done a pretty good job establishing that this is more of an archetypal story, but there's a few more points in those verses that kind of tie into that a little bit deeper, that drive home that idea a little bit deeper, that this is an archetypal story going on. So do you want to hit some of those in these verses?
I just think this section that we just listened to, if we just heard the description of Goliath in all of his might, we're now hearing the description of David in all of his ordinariness, right? Smallness, you might say. So
smallness, right?
Yeah. So he's from Bethlehem, which is a little, that should sound familiar to people, right? Someone else is from Bethlehem, but a little country town. He's from the backwater, right? He's the youngest. In fact, it goes out of his way to say his 3 brothers were soldiers with Saul, and he's out tending the sheep because he was the youngest. So there again, the smallness of David, and he's a shepherd and not a warrior. And I like that too. But there's something about, like, once you understand who David is, it's like the shepherd is the perfect imagery. And we're going to see that here in a moment. But I think by introducing him as the kid who tended the sheep, again, it's contrasting the Goliath, right? He's the kid who's out back. He's from a backwater town. And he kind of wanders naively into this conflict, unawares of what's actually going down. But the last thing I'll say, and then I want to get your take, because it said for 40 days this was happening. But sometimes I think and we'll see it here in the next section, sometimes I think we think of David as like a kid, like a 12-year-old boy.
Right.
But he's no, he's probably not a 12-year-old boy. Right. It's actually talks about
how old?
Well, I don't know how old, but he could have been a young man. The point is that he was the youngest of several brothers, and he was out. He was a shepherd, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he was, a 12-year-old kid. Which again, when we tell the kids' version, sometimes we like to epitomize David as, I don't know, Dennis the Menace with a slingshot in his back pocket, right? And
yeah. Well, I think that's to probably relate to the 4th graders that are listening.
Sure. Yeah.
Our 6th grade audience. Yeah.
All right. So it says in verse 16, for 40 days, the Philistines came forward and took his stand. All right. So now we're encountering the number 40 again.
Yeah. We have another 40 here, which our listeners should notice right away, And when you hear this idea of 40, which go back to the previous episode, we kind of break all that, the concept of 40 down. But the question we should be asking when we hear the number 40 in this context is, what is the transition that this particular occurrence of 40 is implying, right? I mean, because we've said that the 40 is a transition. It's the wilderness. It's the journey, the difficult journey across. So what is the transition that this story is trying to embody, and I personally think, I could be wrong, I'll get your opinion on it, but I think it's the transition of David to becoming king. You know what I mean? Like, he obviously doesn't become king right away, but this is the beginning of his ascension to the throne.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Because remember, the whole book of Samuel is about this transition of kingship. And so to go back to the beginning, Israel wants a king to be like other nations, even though God warns against it, right?
Yeah.
And to compress the story a little bit, man chooses Saul, but God chooses David, right? And so throughout this book, you see this contrast between men's choice of a leader and God's choice of leader. That's why we go back to the shepherd. We'll get into that here in a second. But and I also think that's why it was important for Jesus to be from the line of David, not from the line of Saul. That was very important to link that back to David. And I kind of think that this is the deeper meaning to David being a man after God's own heart even. It's like some people try to kind of simplify that and say, well, he had mistakes, but he always asked for forgiveness, and for that reason he was a man after God's own heart. It's like that, there is that, but I think another deeper understanding is that he was God's chosen leader for Israel, in contrast to Saul, in contrast to what men looked at, the tall stature. He's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's the biggest personality in the room. That's who we want to lead us, right? And God is taking the shepherd boy, which has echoes of Jesus, and that's what he uses as a leader. So in any case, I just think the number 40 here always represents a transition, and the question is, what transition is this particular instance of 40 describing? I don't know. Do you have another theory about what transition this might be?
Well, I think there's always several layers to it, but I could also see, 40 often is associated with the wilderness, right? So I could almost see it representing at a higher level, like the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness right now, right? For 40 days, Goliath comes out, and what has kept them stuck in the wilderness? Well, and not to over psychologize it, but they're looking at the problem wrong. And David comes in, and he's going to actually be the one to lead them out of the wilderness, which ties to your example of 40, right? This is David's ascension, right? But he is going to lead them out of the wilderness because he looks at the problem differently.
He sees it correctly, yes.
He sees it correctly. Okay, so now 40, I think, means all that, right? If you see 40 as the wilderness, then they've been wandering the wilderness for 40 years, like they did at the beginning, right? For this kind of 40 days. And something had to change the way they were viewing this because it's not getting solved.
Yeah, and the 40-year wandering in the wilderness ended with the culmination of defeating the giants in Canaan, crossing the river and defeating the giants in Canaan. So, you're right. This is much of a archetypal pattern. What do we talk about in other episodes? Fractal pattern. It's a fractal pattern. It's not quite as big as getting into the promised land, but the pattern is still the same, Yeah, we're going to cross the brook. We're going to, It's
a compression of that whole thing, right?
Yeah. So, yes, you may be right. That might be a better indication of the transition, meaning the whole story embodies the whole promised land Canaan conflict. And so, maybe when readers read 40 days, they immediately popped in their head, oh, this sounds like Canaan, with the same result.
They're stuck in the wilderness.
But but you got to compare the enemy to God, not the enemy to yourself. Right.
Yeah. No, that's cool. That didn't occur to me, actually, as I was studying for it, but I'm thinking, this is a compression of wandering the wilderness and entering the promised land again.
Well, as soon as you said it, I thought, that sounds exactly like Canaan. That's exactly what's going on. Sure. Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, so we can move the story along now. We've laid the groundwork, but let's have people listen to 23 through 26 because this really is David. I don't know. Pay attention to David reframing the problem here. And in light of everything we just said, some of the background, see if some of these words that he uses make a little more sense now, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?"
Okay, so these verses that we just read here are exactly what we were talking about. It's that fractal nature of the broader pattern. And so right at the beginning, it says that in verse 24, whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Remember, the response to the Canaanites was that they all came back and they're terrified. And then we have David again, who sees it correctly, like you just said. And now there's David's response. It says, wait a second, you guys are framing this all wrong. Quit talking about the size of Goliath. Let's start talking about this in the context of the size of our gods. You know, Yahweh dwarfs Dagon. I promise you we're going to win this.
Yeah.
And so again, David kind of grounds them back to that idea. Remember what we're fighting for. Remember what this represents.
Yeah, and that brings back into this idea of God is fighting for us, right? And when Joshua enters the promised land, and you see this all through Judges, God's promised the Israelites that I will go before you and fight your battles. Okay? In fact, Joshua chapter 23 says, "The Lord has driven out before you the great and powerful nations. To this day, no one has been able to withstand you. One of you routs 1,000 because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised." One of the themes in Joshua and then carries over to Judges is this idea that God will go before you and fight your battles, which goes back to this idea of the champion.
Mm-hmm.
And in Judges, at least, people keep forgetting this, right? And it takes a judge to remind them, right? What are you afraid of?
Right.
God has already said he's going to fight our battles. And the people go, oh, but look at their chariots, right? Look at their technology. And it's like, no. This is Yahweh versus Baal. This is Yahweh versus Dagon, right? And our God is stronger. And so I just want to point that out because that's what David picks up on when he says, you guys are looking at this wrong.
When you understand that, it's so clear. It's all through this that David is seeing reality correctly and the rest of the Israelites are seeing reality incorrectly or through the wrong lens or through the wrong comparison, however you want to say it. And it's like once you pick up on that, it's over and over and over.
Yeah.
And then in verse 26, it says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And I read that, and, well, I'll let you answer it. Why would David point out that he's uncircumcised when circumcision was the mark that set Israel apart from other nations in the first place? Like, why state the obvious?
I don't know. I think, pointing out that he's uncircumcised is just another way to say he's a pagan, he's a barbarian, whatever you, to an Israelite, that's what that meant.
What you're saying, that's important. What you're saying is that statement is more for Israel's sake than it is for a dig on Goliath.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's almost saying it's like it's a battle, a rap battle. It's like, oh man, he owned him on that one. When Goliath would be thinking, yeah, okay, I'm uncircumcised. Yeah, you are the morons that do that.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like it's more for the benefit of Israel, the people behind him, rather than the person in front of him.
No, I think that's true. Yeah. It's more to remind the army behind him to say, look, we are the circumcised, right? We have the covenant with God. We have all these promises that God has said, I will go before you. I will fight your battles. I will take on the enemy deities and I will crush them, right? So, I think to call Goliath uncircumcised, he'd be like, okay, whatever, dude.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so good. So while other people are describing Goliath's size and his armor, David is describing a person outside of God's covenant with the nerve to defy God, right?
It's almost like he's describing his character.
Yes, for the sake of his fellow Israelites, right? He essentially is saying, you guys are looking at the wrong thing. You're evaluating the wrong variable, right? And so in that way, man, this verse could be kind of seen as maybe the interpretive key for the whole chapter. We've brought it up several times now. And so before he's ever put on armor or picked up a stone, he's seeing this battle correctly while everybody else is missing the point.
Yeah. And again, I love how that's the 40 days, right? Because at day 40, David says, enough time in the wilderness, I'm going to help us reframe this, and we're going to put an end to this.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, the more you and I are talking, the more it's just like the light bulb is going off over and over. It's like, yes, here it is again. Here it is again.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so obvious now. I'm kind of upset with myself that I didn't pick this up the first time I read it,
Okay, so the next section then is we'll let people listen to verses 32 through 36. Now, this is David now approaching Saul. And again, there's some important comments in here about how Saul is viewing David, right? And how David is reframing the problem here. So we'll listen to the people, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Yeah.
David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God."
Okay, I love these verses because there's just so much here, and it's so much more than, you get the image of Saul's helmet that's too big for David, or Saul's armor that's too big, and you get this image of the kid wearing his dad's clothes, right? But this is rich with symbolism, the way David and Saul kind of go back and forth here in this moment. Do you want to kick us off on this one?
Well, the first comment is just Saul's reaction is, "You're only a boy," right? Which again, I think he actually says you're a young man, which again, he could be, who knows? He could be 16, 18, right? But I think the point of that comment is Saul is still seeing things wrong, because David's already said, like, this is an uncircumcised Philistine. We have Yahweh on our side. What is the first thing out of Saul's mouth? You're only a young man. What are you going to do? And it's like, okay, this is the problem, Saul, right? He's like, you're a head taller than everyone else. Why aren't you out there? And this is why you're not going to be king anymore.
Yes.
Right?
No, you're exactly. It's like he cut his own throat on this one. Because first of all, it sounds like, I don't know, I'm sure you ran into this. You get the new guy at work, and he comes and he's like, "Here's how we ought to do this." And I'm like, "Dude, you've been doing this 6 months. Let's dial this back a little bit," right? And when I was younger, I would do the same thing. I would be like, "Well, here's the way this should be done." And you get the whole, "Man, I was neck deep in the middle of a war when your mama was still wiping your nose." That whole line that you see from the movies.
Yeah.
So it's funny that youth still carries weight, and it's still an insult to this day. Like, "Man, you were in diapers when I was doing this, so let's let the men handle this." Right? But it's a hollow insult, because it's like he's not attacking what David just said in the previous verses, talking about the uncircumcised Philistine. He's not addressing what David is trying to get everybody to see. Quit comparing us to Goliath and start comparing our gods to each other, because that's what this battle's about. And so, I don't know. Yes, Saul plays that card. It's like, "Okay, kid, I appreciate your idealistic fervor, but that's just going to get you killed. Right? At least put on my armor."
And it's funny because, like, they're clearly stuck. Again, that's what the 40 days represent, at least in part, right? They're clearly stuck. And so, to your example, it's like the young sales manager comes in and says, "All right, we're going to do things different here." And the old sales guys are like, "I was landing accounts when, your mom was wiping your nose." Okay, let's take a look at our sales. You're failing miserably. So, right, there's an element of that, right? There's an element of like, okay, your way's not working. You've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 days, so you're going to listen to me. I don't care if you think I'm a young man. And to follow that up then the next phrase is, he says, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." Now, this goes back to, when he was a shepherd protecting the flock. But again, man, I think that phrase right there encapsulates the way David sees the problem, because it's like, well, look, this isn't a lion and a bear. But if you see the problem the way David sees it, David's like, Goliath's just a little bit bigger version of a lion and a bear. Right?
Right. I think I'd rather take on Goliath than a bear we're talking about a grizzly.
Yeah, yeah.
I might take a black bear. But no, a grizzly bear? No, man, give me Goliath. I've got a better shot with him. David is pointing out that he's dealt with monsters before. That's the point. And
I like
you mentioned
that,
earlier.
monsters, yeah. I've taken mountain monsters before, and this is just another variety.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that David's not a warrior, but a shepherd. But I think right here in that statement, David's saying that a shepherd is actually equipped to be a warrior if necessary. And I think he paints this really cool image.
Yeah.
You know, we think to be a warrior means that you're training to be a warrior, that you're having sword fights with other men and you're going to battle, and you know what I mean? But David here is saying something like, I've taken my role as a shepherd seriously enough that the warrior has also developed out of that. Do you know what I'm saying? And so he's completely redefining what it means to be equipped for a fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Saul's focused on trying to let's find a professional warrior. And David's focus is to be a devoted shepherd. And he doesn't tell Saul that he's been secretly practicing sword play in my backyard and therefore I'm equipped. Instead, he argues that his everyday obligation to protect the vulnerable, right, to protect the sheep,
which is what Saul should have been.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
That inherently forged the attributes of a warrior.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. Man, that is so good. And it's a detail that really foreshadows the focus of Jesus, right? The good shepherd.
Yeah.
And, oh man, there's so much there. I absolutely love that line, because once you uncover it, you're like, oh man, there's so much more than saying, hey, I've taken a lion, I've taken a bear. He's saying the attributes that you're looking for, Saul, are not the attributes that you should be looking for in the warrior. You should be looking for the dedicated person whose actions actually forge the attributes of a warrior.
Yeah, something like that. I also think it's, Saul saying, well, you haven't been trained as a warrior. David's like, yeah, because I'm actually better equipped for the problem in front of us, not your trained warriors.
Yes.
And this idea, too, if you think about, I've killed a lion and a bear. And it's like, well, how do you kill a bear? Well, you don't run up and wrestle it. That's not how David killed.
Right.
He killed him with his sling, right? So, again, when you view the problem like that, Goliath is just a bigger version. It's like, I'm not going to run up and wrestle that freaking monster. Right?
Yeah, right. But which is why the bear and the lion are such good examples.
Yes, it's why
he didn't conform to the bear and the lion.
Yeah.
He did his own thing as a shepherd.
It's why it's a great.
And that's what worked.
Yeah, it's why it's a great example. It's not just, I killed a lion and a bear. It's like, look, while you're sitting here, in your camp for 40 days, I've been out slaying monsters, right? So once you've killed some monsters, this is just another monster.
Okay, do you want to talk about the slingshot?
Yeah, the ancient slingshot, this is really interesting. It's a much more dangerous weapon than maybe what we hear when we think of a slingshot. It's really just a sling weapon, right? But I think you even looked up a video.
Well, we'll put the video up for if you're on the video feed. But yeah, for everybody else who's just listening, it's just that old style sling that you spin around, and you throw the stone. I mean, it was extremely deadly, and it says that it was capable of shattering bones, causing fatal head injuries, and the stopping power of that sling, it matches the modern handgun, right? Almost.
Yeah, that was crazy.
And so when you understand that, you understand the velocity and the stopping power and the fact that it can break bones, then it frames this conflict a little bit differently. It's almost like, dude, why are you bringing your sword to a gunfight? Best of luck.
Yeah.
And then and now I start seeing it less as an underdog story and more of a Goliath, what were you thinking story? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, yeah.
Goliath was the underdog here.
I like that when you reframe the problem and you look at how you've equipped yourself to take on the monster. Yeah, I don't know that, and I think that's the whole point of the story, is I don't think David saw this as I'm an underdog here. David's thinking, why didn't this occur to you? This is how you take a monster down.
Yeah. This is a piece of cake.
I've done it before, right?
Yeah, right.
The other interesting thing about this idea of the sling is elsewhere, I think in Judges, it's actually Judges chapter 20. I'll just read this real quick. It said, among all the soldiers, there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Okay, now this was a almost like a special forces unit of the Benjaminites, as I understand it. But it's interesting that in Judges, they actually frame this as like, we might say they were snipers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the left-handedness is less about, hey, they happen to be left-handed, and more about, we talked about this in the Judges episode, left-handedness represents the unconventional.
Yeah.
The unconventional. That's it. You know, it could be the way you fight. It could be the way you think, whatever. It's an unconventional nature about somebody. And so I think that's kind of interesting, and it plays into all the way back into the David story. Is Saul is trying to give him the sword, is trying to give him the shield, is trying to give him the components of hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
And David is taking the unconventional. And he's saying, I don't need that. You know, I don't need a shield at all. I mean, he's not going to get anywhere near me with that 25-pound, barbell that he's going to be throwing at me. I can snipe him at 100 yards. He's not going to get anywhere near me. You know what I mean?
It's kind of, I don't know. It's like, Steph Curry versus Shaq. It's like you need to muscle up against Shaq inside. He's like, dude, you're nuts. He can't guard me outside, though. I have no plans of going down in the paint.
Yeah, let him try to catch the water bug out of the three-point line, and I'm just going to sink him all day long.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
But it is interesting that this idea of the sling, though, again, we can kind of make this into a kid's thing, but it really is. It's like David's like, look, have you forgotten? We have this elite special forces group. You're dogging the idea that I'm here with my sling. Have you forgotten the Benjaminite special forces? This is what they're, and what he's getting at is this is what they were trained to do. And you're trying to engage in hand-to-hand combat. It's almost like, what's wrong with you, right?
Yeah, why are you trying to beat them at their game?
Yeah.
Why don't you play your game? And so, and I really like this idea. Saul says, wear this armor, wear this big armor. Goliath later on says, we'll get to that, where it says, fight like me. And David is refusing both of them. And if you want a practical takeaway for this particular story, this is it. Don't imitate others. You know what I mean? Fight according to who God made you to be. And David is the consummate shepherd, like literally and figuratively. And when he approaches a challenge this way, it actually turns out not to be an underdog story, but a what was Goliath thinking story. Like I just said, who brings a knife to a gunfight? And that's really the practical lesson you can get out of this if you want just something practical without digging into all the history like we're doing today.
Yeah. The last thing I'll point about the sling is that I'm, again, appreciating the idea that all throughout Judges, and then this is a continuation of it, that God uses the left hand. It fits right into the left-handedness almost. God uses the unconventional means to defeat a far superior army. And he does it time and time again throughout Judges. And so, again, I think David with the sling is just another example of that. God's like, I don't care that they have bronze. I don't care how much his spearhead weighs. None of that matters to me.
Yeah. Quit trying to make that comparison, man.
Yeah.
What has God equipped you to do?
Yeah, something like that. All right, let's have people listen to 48 to 50. This is where he kills Goliath, and then we'll come back and finish the story up.
As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him.
Okay, so these are the verses where obviously David kills Goliath. And it says in verse 49, reaching into his bag and taking out a stone. And this is actually worth going back for the previous verses that we didn't talk about. The 5 smooth stones. Did you find any significance to the 5 smooth stones? Because I've heard a couple things like, if he only needed 1, why did he get 5? And I've heard Goliath had 4 brothers, and so he was preparing for all 5 of them. I don't know. Which is kind of interesting idea. I don't know. Is there anything symbolic? I actually had trouble figuring out anything definitive, but I guess there's some interesting ideas out there.
Yeah, I didn't pick up anything really deep symbolically. There's the practical reason that, hey, if you got 6 chambers in your gun, go ahead and fill them up, right?
Yeah, right.
That would have been a gangster move for Dave just to take 1 stone. But again,
would have been great.
This is more practical. Like, he's fought a lion and a bear. I don't know. Just the practicality is like, hey, dummy, take more than 1 stone, right? Because it may take more than 1 to take this monster down, right? But there's been some theological ideas. I think Augustine, he said the 5 stones represent the 5 books of Moses, which is kind of interesting. It's this idea of it's their beginning story, it's their origin story that's led up to Joshua, Judges. And again, if you see David as a continuation of this story, then, I could see that representation there of.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
It's a little obscure.
Yeah,
yes.
a little theological. It's not even symbolic. It's more just at the theological level. But no, I didn't come up with anything other than, I think what's more symbolic is the fact that he has to go to a river, a brook, to get these stones.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, the threshold that has to be crossed, right?
Yeah.
And, yeah, no, that's totally worth pointing out. I'm glad you did it, because we've talked about the water, wilderness, mountain pattern throughout the Bible. And this is a smaller version of that same phenomenon. So the brook, the valley, the pursuit up the other side to defeat the enemy, that's essentially that water, wilderness, mountain. And so at the bottom of the valley, you've got the brook. And so the brook becomes the Red Sea. It becomes the Jordan River. It becomes the temple entrance, right? It's the necessary threshold that has to be crossed. And so, of course, he has to cross the brook.
Yeah.
And, of course, this story ports it out. You know what I mean? It's not just a silly detail like, okay, just to get your frame of reference, he had to go down to the brook to get the smooth stones. It's more like a retelling of the Jordan River crossing to go back to the Canaan story.
Right. They cross over the Jordan to enter the Promised Land. And if you see all the ways that they've been in the wilderness, for 40 days, it only makes sense. You'd be shocked if he didn't have to go cross a brook,
right,
to take on the giant. That's where the giant is, right? It's the other side of the brook.
It's almost like you can take. Yeah, it's almost like you can take any significant story and say, okay, where's the water feature in this? Where's the wilderness feature? Where's the mountain feature? And it's almost like the pattern just lays on. It's crazy how many times that happens, to the point that you could think of any water feature. What comes to mind in the Bible? Just when I say water, what comes to mind? All those things, you can lay that pattern right over. You can see it.
Blood, the Red Sea, the Jordan. Enough. Yeah, it's
right. Look close enough, you'll find the 40. Look close enough, you'll find the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You'll find the ascent, the descent. Yeah, it's all there.
Yeah. Okay, so he strikes the Philistine on the forehead in verse 49. He falls over dead. And again, I use the idea of the Achilles heel, right? Like, what is that? That's the one place you could kill Achilles, right? Is the heel.
Right.
So the legend goes, right? So it's like David knew the one vulnerable point. And it's the same thing if you're hunting animals, right? If you're killing a lion or a bear, it's like you better know the one place to hit them, or you better have a lot more stones in your pocket, right? Because that thing's coming at you. So it wasn't just a lucky shot.
Right. Well, also symbolically, the forehead is the place of identity, right? So the high priest wears Yahweh's name on the forehead. We saw this in Israel, the little box that's strapped to their forehead to this day. The beast marks the forehead. Revelation seals God's people on the forehead, right? So it's a symbolic way of saying the death blow was delivered directly to his identity. And it goes back to the idea that we're not talking about David and Goliath. We're talking about two spiritual worldviews. It's Yahweh versus Dagon. And so when it struck Goliath in the head, it was a blow, not just the fatal blow to Goliath, it was a blow to the Philistines' very identity.
Yeah, that's true. You brought this up real quick, but it's also interesting because it does say that there were 4 other giants, that Goliath had brothers, right? It says it later in Samuel. I think it's 2 Samuel, where it actually calls out specifically that once David is, I think he's king by that time, and he's got his own band of warriors with him, that they actually kill the other 4 giants. And so, I don't know, maybe the 5 stones did represent something that, like, hey, they've got 5 giants, and David's like, well, just in case, I'm packing 5 stones, right?
Yeah, so were there actually 4 brothers? I mean, I know that later on in Samuel that they destroyed them. Do you think there was something a little bit more significant to the 5 stones representing the 5 brothers, or the 5 total?
Well, it could be, and I looked this up because I knew it was kind of alluded to, but in 2 Samuel chapter 21, it actually specifically says, and it's talking about these giants, he said these 4, so it lists 4 more, right? These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath. All right, so they were brothers or kin with Goliath, and they fell by the hand of David. and by the hand of his servants or his warriors with him.
Oh, that's cool.
So it actually does
So it was
say...
specifically David. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, okay, so this starts to wrap things up then, because the verse we just read here, talking about the 4 other giants and the fact that David killed them, is significant because David then is the person who finishes the job of cleansing the promised land of the giants.
Yes.
And 2 Samuel, the verse we just read, talks about it. There is something very significant to say they were descendants of the Gath giant clan, and David killed them.
Yeah. Most Christians have no idea why Goliath matters. He's not just a big soldier, right? He's that last representation of the Nephilim tradition that we talked about last episode. I'm glad you found that verse, because when it says that David killed the final 4, the conquest is truly complete. And again, to go back to Canaan, it's that thread that connects Joshua to Judges to Samuel that you were talking about. It's one continuous storyline that you don't want to miss because you simply know the story in isolation.
Yeah, and it really does. So Saul and David don't get along. David's getting all the glory, right? But eventually Samuel says, Saul, you're not God's anointed anymore. David becomes king. All right, that's important because this really does establish David as the new Joshua, the person who finally cleansed the promised land of the giants. Mm-hmm. And it also points to the idea of why Saul was not the guy. Like, you didn't do it, right?
Yeah.
You were hiding in your tent when all this was going down.
Yeah, and it's why that number 40 feels like the transition point from Saul to David.
Yeah.
Saul is what man considered to be a leader and the attributes that he embodied, and David is what God considered to be a leader and the attributes that he embodied.
Yeah, I've been reading some of the Arthurian stories that Arthur comes and he's able to pull this sword out of the stone. Right. And that signals to everyone this is the true king, right? I think something similar is happening here with the story of David and Goliath. I think this is a signal to all the people, he just pulled the sword out of the stone. This is our true king here.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Another detail worth pointing out is that after David strikes Goliath with the stone, I mean, he's probably already dead, just from what we talked about, from the velocity of the stone. If it hits you in the head, I mean, it's like being shot in the face. But David then turns around and cuts off his head. You're right, which now maybe it seems a little performative or over the top until you remember exactly what you just said. First of all, David is the Arthurian legend. He pulls the sword from the stone and he lops off the head of not the final Nephilim because he's got the brothers, but the Nephilim idea. He beheads it. And so once you remember that both David and Goliath are representative of the gods of both armies, then you can start to pull all this stuff together. So back in I mentioned earlier, back in Samuel chapter 5, you remember that the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, right? And they placed it in the same room as their altar to Dagon, their god, right? And when they came in the next morning, if you remember, the statue had fallen, and so they prop it back up. And then the morning after that, they came in again, and it was fallen again. And the verses say that the hands and the head were broken off the statue. And so when David cuts off Goliath's head, it's like he's physically reenacting Yahweh's victory over Dagon.
The head has fallen off
Goliath
again.
falls. Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. It's exactly what it is. Goliath falls face down, just like his God statue did, and David removes his head to show that their champion has met the exact same demise as the deity that he represented.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so clear once you kind of understand and start to pull these threads together. And because of that means that David is the representative of the new king, the proper king that was God appointed, not man appointed.
Yeah, and I think there's so many signals that that's what's going on here. The completion of the promised land, the rightful king, the one thing that didn't occur to me until we started talking about it on this episode is the whole reenactment of entering the promised land again. It's all that.
Yeah. Okay, well, just to wrap this up, I would encourage people to read 1 Samuel chapter 17, and you'll pick up on all these things. Once you kind of have the background that has been laid out, there's so much more that we just didn't have time to get to. But yeah, I would encourage people to read it. Did you have any other final thoughts on this?
My only final thought is to really get it practical, right? So it's like, okay, what does this mean for how I live my life or whatever? I just like the idea that David reframes the problem. if I'm wandering in the wilderness for 40 days or 40 years and there's a problem I can't solve, what does this call me to do? It calls me to look at it differently. If I have God on my side, right, then what is it that I'm missing? Am I trying to do it on my own? Am I trying to solve it by myself? How has God equipped me, right? Because I guarantee you, one of the takeaways at a really practical level is reframe the problem, look how God has equipped you, and then go face whatever. Go face the monster that God's equipped you to take down.
Well, and I'm glad you said that about, if God's on my side, because it's easy to hear that and think, the buddy Jesus, God in my back pocket.
Yeah.
I can get whatever I want out of it. But when you sincerely frame a problem and compare it to God, that implicitly requires that you adjust your own self and say, well, do I have the right to compare my problems to God? Am I anywhere near God in this moment? I mean, or is that the reason I'm sitting have this problem to begin with? So just the act of saying, comparing your problems to God, again, is not saying that he's like a Merlin or a genie in a bottle that you can just rub the lamp.
Right.
It implicitly says, am I aligned with that to begin with? Because a lot of times, man, that's the answer to your problem is you're not aligned with God anyway. You're not aligned with reality.
Yeah.
But if you are aligned, then you can say, well, if I'm aligned with God, now I can compare my problems to God. And yes, it's a mistake to look at my own abilities and say, well, I can't tackle this. But if you're aligned with God, then you have to say that, well, okay, then I compare my problems to him and not myself.
Yeah, yeah. There's almost several steps in there to say, if you're stuck somewhere in the wilderness, okay, realign yourself with God, right? View the problem from that perspective. Make sure you have a clear picture of reality, and then look at what you've been equipped to do and see if that doesn't reframe the problem altogether, right? Because chances are it's just you've been looking at it, the guy with the little sword and the monster across the field at me, right? It's like, and that's not how David saw things. And I love it. And so I'll just finish by saying that I'm not sure that David even saw this as an underdog story. And that's where I kind of think we get this wrong.
No, I'm certain he didn't. And every sermon you've sat in that sort of frames this story and it's like, well, let's start naming the Goliaths that are in your life. That's just a shallow way to view it. And I hope what we've uncovered in this episode is that your alignment with the Creator is the fundamental place that you start. And once that alignment is correct, then everything lines up to that, and therefore your problems, now have to face up to that. But you have to be in alignment first.
Yeah.
And this is just the recurring story of everybody else was not aligned properly. Saul was not aligned properly.
Yeah.
It was David that was aligned properly and saw it the correct way. He just had to demonstrate it for everybody else to follow, which is what a true leader does.
Yeah, yeah. All this plays into setting up David as being the true king. You could see that he was equipped for it his whole life, and that's why he becomes basically Israel's greatest king. So there you go.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Next episode, where are we taking this?
All right, so this one should be really interesting. We're going to do Balaam and his donkey. Remember the story how the donkey
sure.
talks back to Balaam?
Yeah.
So
Okay, this has a lot of fairy tale elements to it.
It does. It lends itself very much almost to that kind of like this weird, why is this even in the Bible, right?
Yeah, the talking animals.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So
okay, this will be good.
That'll be fun
okay,
unpacking that one. And if you want to read ahead, read Numbers chapter 22, and then we'll talk about
we'll unpack that story.
The talking donkey.
All right, that sounds good.
I actually think they're all going to be cool. This is going to be a cool series.